Also, I had to find, one time they wanted me to find out if there was such a thing as a poison that was undetectable, especially one that seemed to mimic a heart attack, that would kill someone, but it would appear that they had a heart attack. I did find such a thing.
Does this pistol fire the dart?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chairman, and a special one was developed which potentially would be able to enter the target without perception.
The poison was frozen into some sort of dart, and then it was shot at very high speed into the person, so when it reached the person it would melt inside them, and the only thing would be like one little tiny red dot on their body, which was hard to detect. There wouldn't be a needle left or anything like that in the person.
But also the toxin itself would not appear in the autopsy?
Yes, so that there was no way of perceiving that the target was hit.
For many years I didn't even tell my friends I worked for CIA because I was embarrassed. It's colored my life. It always will. It's like a shadow that falls over my life all the time. I still, if I say anything against them, I turn around wondering if I'm being followed. I never even thought of joining the CIA. First of all, I thought I probably couldn't get in because it was considered the Cadillac of government agencies, and they mostly hired from Ivy League colleges, and I was just out of high school, went right to work for Veterans Administration. And actually it was the typewriter repairman came in to repair my typewriter one day, and he said, you know, you shouldn't be working here, you should be working at a nicer place. They test you a lot. Huge testing. I mean, when you put into this personnel pool, there are probably 2 or 3 weeks of tests where it's all day long, every single day. And there are IQ tests, there are personality tests. The questions that bothered me the most was when I took the polygraph test. And in the polygraph test, they ask you such incredibly personal questions. For instance, they asked me if I was a virgin. And I was 18. And I thought, what business is it of theirs whether I am or not? And I was rather embarrassed to tell them that I was, because I don't think any of my girlfriends were. I was raised very strict. There were very few women at CIA who were other than secretaries. It was very sexist. It was the male establishment, the white male establishment. I asked a couple of times why it was that there were no blacks there and why there were no gay people there, although they didn't call them gays in that time. In those days, I think they called them queers in those days. And they said because homosexuals could not be cleared because they could be blackmailed. They said that blacks couldn't be cleared because blacks just weren't, they were just still too primitive. They just weren't usually smart enough. And they didn't have the kind of background that white people had. I mean, I didn't think that much at the time because it was like sort of standard operating procedure. But when I think about it now, I'm really quite shocked how you probably would never get a job if you're black. I was assigned as a secretary in the audio surveillance division. They were experts on listening devices and hidden microphones and that sort of thing. I did also very often help the operatives get the documents that they needed. Once in a while I'd have to make a quick trip to the State Department to pick up their passports. And sometimes if we couldn't get the passports in time, then I'd have to go over to Graphic Arts Reproduction Division so that they could forge one for them. Most of them were artists in there, but they were recruited from prisons because they were forgers, and they were master forgers. They were people who knew how to forge money, and they forged all kinds of things. That's how they made their living. And so the FBI would arrest them, and then the CIA would come and spring them. Then I went to technical services, where I was in charge of finding documents that you don't find in libraries, like like where you put explosives on a bridge. Where's the best place to put an explosive on a bridge, and what kind of explosive do you have to get that goes underwater without it, destroying its effectiveness? Also, I had to find, one time they wanted me to find out if there was such a thing as a poison that was undetectable, especially one that seemed to mimic a heart attack, that would kill someone, but it would appear that they had a heart attack. I did find such a thing.
Does this pistol fire the dart?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chairman, and a special one was developed which potentially would be able to enter the target without perception.
The poison was frozen into some sort of dart, and then it was shot at very high speed into the person, so when it reached the person it would melt inside them, and the only thing would be like one little tiny red dot on their body, which was hard to detect. There wouldn't be a needle left or anything like that in the person.
Have you brought with you some of those devices which would have enabled the CIA to use this poison for?
We have indeed.
For killing people?
The round thing at the top is obviously the sight. It works by electricity. There's a battery in the handle, and it fires a small dart.
And the dart itself, when it strikes the target, does the target know that he's been hit and about to die?
A special one was developed which potentially would be able to enter the target without perception.
As a murder instrument, that's about as efficient as you can get, isn't it?
It is a weapon, a very serious weapon.
But also the toxin itself would not appear in the autopsy?
Yes, so that there was no way of perceiving that the target was hit.
I think the first time that I seriously questioned anything that was more than, I just couldn't take it anymore, was when I came across this document. It was eyes only, and it was to my boss, but he only had one hand and a hook in the other hand, so I always opened all of his mail and his packages and so forth. And this one, he wasn't in the office. I opened it and I read it. It said eyes only. I wanted to read it because I wasn't supposed to, probably. And it was a report about a mission where they had blown up a bridge in Asia somewhere, and they had killed a number of women and children who were on their way to market that morning. It was reported as though they were really proud, mission accomplished. That one bothered me a lot. When my boss came in, I gave him his mail and I mentioned this, and I said, "This is wrong. These women hadn't done anything. These children didn't deserve to die. Why did we do that?" And he said, that's the fortunes of war. And I said, "But we're not at war. We're certainly not at war in that country. Why did we do that? I don't understand it." And he said, "Well, you're very young. When you get older, you'll understand those things." I think probably all of us became addicted to the danger, to the intrigue. It was living a fantasy. It was actually living a fantasy and being on the inside. And it was very hard to leave, even though I felt that they did wrong, and I would never, ever work for an agency like that now, because I realized that it wasn't because I was a child or I was so young. It was because it was wrong. But at the time, it was really exciting. After that, there was no other job I could have ever again in my life that would be that exciting. I knew that.
Well, whatever your purpose, the document you sent to the President contained your recommendations for lifting or relaxing certain restraints.
Or keeping restraints, as in the case of the military.
And in some cases, keeping restraints. Now, was it your understanding when you submitted that document to the President that his authority was being requested for lifting or relaxing restraints if he chose to accept your recommendation?
Yes.
Now, turning to the question of mail coverage, on page 2 of your recommendations. I read, recommendation, restrictions on legal coverage should be removed. And I take it by legal coverage you had reference to the procedure that enables intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies to look at the envelopes. If the procedure is followed, there is a legal way for doing that.
Yes, sir.
Then you recommended also present restrictions on covert coverage should be relaxed on selected targets of priority, foreign intelligence and internal security interests. Now here, you were referring to opening the mail, were you not?
Yes.
And that was against the law, was it not?
Yes.
So, you were making a very serious recommendation to Mr. Nixon. You were recommending that he authorize mail openings, even though such openings were a violation of the law.
Well, I think what was being recommended was that they be employed in spite of the fact that there was a federal law that prohibited. But as in in relationship both to mail and to surreptitious entry, there was, and of course electronic surveillance, there was the whole question as to whether in essence the Fourth Amendment applied to the President in the exercise of his internal security power. And I think that's why I earlier said that when you asked me about our thinking. I think this is where the question arose. In my mind, what we were talking about is something that I'd been told had been done for 25 years. It had been done with the knowledge of the professional intelligence community, the people who had been here long before we got in town and be here long after we left town. The question really was the question of whether inherent in the executive power in matters involving internal security or the security of the state, the President could act contrary to the dictates of the statute. And I think that was the kind of dilemma that we got ourselves in.
You were recommending that the President in this case authorize mail openings even though such action was contrary to the federal statute.
Yes, sir.
Yes. And you have suggested that there might be some inherent right that circumvents the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, guaranteeing citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures without a warrant, bearing upon the national security responsibilities of the President.
Senator, I think this really goes to the heart of the matter, as you well know, and I think if you recall in the Safe Streets Act, there was a proviso clause in there that said to the effect that nothing in this act is to be deemed to limit the power of whatever power the President may have with respect to national security matters. I think it was that kind of approach to this whole area of Fourth Amendment rights as they involve in terms of national security, internal security, that opened the door to men who in good conscience thought they could go ahead and do it.
Now, you yourself have suggested this was a very serious question.
Yes, sir.
As someone said, after what has happened in this country during the past 2 years, there are no more future shocks. But whether there are shocks or not, today's open hearing did focus major attention on the way the CIA has gone about its business in the United States.
The subject today concerns CIA's involvement in the development of bacteriological warfare materials with the Army's biological laboratory at Fort Detrick, CIA's retention of an amount of shellfish toxin, and CIA's use and investigation of various chemicals and drugs. The relationship between the CIA and the Army Biological Laboratory at Fort Detrick as an activity requiring further investigation surfaced in late April of this year. It resulted from information provided by a CIA officer not directly associated with the project in response to my repeated directives that all past activities which might now be considered questionable be brought to the attention of agency management. Information provided by him and by 2 other officers aware of the project indicated that the project at Fort Detrick involved the development of bacteriological warfare agents, some lethal, and associated delivery systems suitable for clandestine use. A search was made for any records or other information available on the project. This search produced information about the basic agreement between the Army and the CIA relating to the project and some limited records covering its activities from its beginning in 1952 to its termination in 1970. In the course of the investigation, CIA's laboratory storage facilities were searched, and about 11 grams, a little less than half an ounce, of shellfish toxin and 8 milligrams of cobra venom were discovered in a little-used, vaulted storeroom in an agency building. A major early requirement of the agency was to find a replacement for the standard cyanide L pill issued to agents in hazardous situations during World War II. This was the basis on which eventually we discovered the shellfish toxin. The only application of this toxin was in the U-2 flight over the USSR in May 1960, during which Gary Powers carried such a device concealed in a silver dollar. In the Powers case, the grooves of the drill were filled with shellfish toxin. He obviously did not use it and was not instructed to do so. It was offered to him to provide him with an option. The Powers flight was the only time we are aware that the toxin was provided for operational use, although the L pill was made available for earlier flights. The primary agency interest was in the development of dissemination devices to be used with standard chemicals off the shelf. Various dissemination devices, such as a fountain pen dart launcher and an engine head bolt designed to release when heated, appeared to be peculiarly suited for clandestine use. Available records do not indicate that all specific items were developed exclusively for the CIA, as work on similar devices was also done for the Army. At the time the toxin was found, the officer responsible for the project in 1970 stated that he had no recollection as to how it got there. On the 30th of June, discussions were held with a retired agency officer who had provided the initial lead. This man, who had been the GS-15 branch chief in 1970, stated that the toxin had in fact been moved from Fort Detrick and stored in the laboratory. This was done on the basis of his own decision after conversations with the responsible project officer. He further stated that he made this decision based on the fact that the cost and difficulty of isolating the shellfish toxin were so great that it simply made no sense to destroy it.
Yes. Isn't it true, too, that the effort not only involved designing a gun that could strike a human target without knowledge of the person who'd been struck, but also the toxin itself would not appear in the autopsy?
Well, there was an attempt.
Or the dart?
Yes, so that there was no way of perceiving that the target was hit.
As a murder instrument, that's about as efficient as you can get, isn't it?
It is a weapon, a very serious weapon.
This record seems to disclose an additional concession, namely the lack of accountability, so that we not only have a secret agency, but we have an agency about which there's some question as to its accountability to the authority of the President or to the authority of the National Security Council. The record seems to disclose that there is no presidential or Security Council order in the first place directing the CIA to establish this program at all. Secondly, there appears to be no report by the CIA to higher authority of the existence of these toxins or biological weapons. Thirdly, there seems to be no evidence that those in charge of the CIA inquired of subordinates as to the existence of toxins or biological weapons, or that following the presidential order decreeing the destruction of such toxins, that any formal order went forth within the CIA to require their destruction. Moreover, the record seems to support the notion that it was only by chance that the leadership of the CIA became aware some years later of even the existence of these lethal toxins, which were in violation of a direct presidential order. In short, the record's a mess, and we may never know just exactly what happened.
No one has interviewed Gottlieb as to why he destroyed the material or what they contained, the records.
No, we have not interviewed him as to the reason.
You know what what documents he destroyed?
We're very unsure as to the total. We do not have an inventory of them.
Do you think they might have said who it was authorized the formulation or the retention of this stuff? Do you have any reason to think it might or might not contain that information?
In this case, I doubt that it would have very much, because this case indicates, from the evidence we have at hand...
Does it say anything, have any reason to think that it might say how, if at all, this material was used in an aggressive way against someone to kill someone?
Well, there may well be some of that.
When was the documentation destroyed?
In 1973.
It didn't happen to be destroyed at the same time those tapes at the
1972. 1972.
1972. When in 1972?
In November, I believe it was.
In November of 72. Do you have any idea what volume of records were destroyed?
I do not know.
Do you know who authorized the destruction, if anyone?
As I said, there was a memorandum of agreement between the director and Mr. Gottlieb at that time.
And the director at that time was?
Mr. Helms.
Mr. Helms is here in this room, I believe, Mr. Chairman, and I take it we'll have an opportunity to hear from him
Mr. Helms will be our witness tomorrow morning's hearings. I believe he's the lead-off witness.
I won't prolong my opportunity to examine the witness much longer, Mr. Chairman. I understand we're going to try to operate under the 10-minute rule. May I ask you only this further question, then, in general, Mr. Golby? You've heard of the doctrine of plausible deniability.
Yes, and I've rejected it now, Senator. I say that we cannot depend upon that anymore.
The question I was going to put to you, is that a phrase of art in the intelligence community? Does it have a separate significance that you understand?
It was a rationale used in earlier years.
What does it mean?
If the United States could deny something and not be clearly demonstrated as having said something falsely, then the United States could do so.
In the case of assassinations, in the case of any other of domestic surveillance, in the case of the formulation of poisons, under that previous rationale, would the doctrine of plausible deniability have led the agency to destroy records, to conceal evidence, or to compartmentalize to the point where it would be a committee such as this later would have been unable to establish what really happened?
I think the plausible denial concept was used in the sense of international diplomatic relationships.
Are you saying by that it would not have applied to the formulation of toxic materials?
I would not say that it didn't have anything to do with it at all, but I think that the basic rationale for the doctrine of plausible denial was so that our nation could deny something and not be tagged with it.
Colby.
3. The committee has tried to be fair to the persons involved in the events under examination, while at the same time responding to a need to understand the facts in sufficient detail to lay a basis for informed recommendations. With these standards in mind, the committee has arrived at the following findings and conclusions. A. Findings concerning the plots themselves. 1. Officials of the United States government initiated plots to assassinate Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba. The committee finds that officials of the United States government initiated and participated in plots to assassinate Patrice Lumumba and Fidel Castro. The plot to kill Lumumba was conceived in the latter half of 1960 by officials of the United States government and quickly advanced to the point of sending poisons to the Congo to be used for the assassination. The effort to assassinate Castro began in 1960 and continued until 1965. The plans to assassinate Castro using poisoned cigars, exploding seashells, and a contaminated diving suit did not advance beyond the laboratory phase. The plot involving underworld figures reached the stage of producing poison pills, establishing the contacts necessary to send them into Cuba, procuring potential assassins within Cuba, and apparently delivering the pills to the island itself. One 1960 episode involved a Cuban who initially had no intention of engaging in assassination, but who finally agreed, at the suggestion of the CIA, to attempt to assassinate Raul Castro if the opportunity arose. In the Amlash operation, which extended from 1963 through 1965, the CIA gave active support and encouragement to a Cuban whose intent to assassinate Castro was known, and provided him with the means of carrying out an assassination. 2. No foreign leaders were killed as a result of assassination plots initiated by officials of the United States. The poisons intended for use against Patrice Lumumba were never administered to him, and there is no evidence that the United States was in any way involved in Lumumba's death at the hands of his Congolese enemies. The efforts to assassinate Castro failed. 3. American officials encouraged or were privy to coup plots which resulted in the deaths of Trujillo, Diem, and Schneider. American officials clearly desired the overthrow of Trujillo, offered both encouragement and guns to local dissidents who sought his overthrow and whose plans included assassination. American officials also supplied those dissidents with pistols and rifles. American officials offered encouragement to the Vietnamese generals who plotted Diem's overthrow, and a CIA official in Vietnam gave the generals money after the coup had begun. However, Diem's assassination was neither desired nor suggested by officials of the United States. The record reveals that United States officials offered encouragement to the Chilean dissidents who plotted the kidnapping of General René Schneider, but American officials did not desire or encourage Schneider's death. Certain high officials did know, however, that the dissidents planned to kidnap General Schneider. As Director Colby testified before the committee, the death of a foreign leader is a risk foreseeable in any coup attempt. In the cases we have considered, the risk of death was in fact known in varying degrees. It was widely known that the dissidents in the Dominican Republic intended to assassinate Trujillo. The contemplation of coup leaders at one time to assassinate New, President Diem's brother, was communicated to the upper levels of the United States government. While the CIA and perhaps the White House knew that the coup leaders in Chile planned to kidnap General Schneider, it was not anticipated that he would be killed, although the possibility of his death should have been recognized as a foreseeable risk of his kidnapping. 4. The plots occurred in a Cold War atmosphere perceived to be of crisis proportions. The committee fully appreciates the importance of evaluating the assassination plots in the historical context within which they occurred. In the preface to this report, we described the perception generally shared within the United States during the depths of the Cold War that our country faced a monolithic enemy in communism. That attitude helps explain the assassination plots which we have reviewed, although it does not justify them. Those involved nevertheless appeared to believe they were advancing the best interests of their country. 5. American officials had exaggerated notions about their ability to control the actions of coup leaders. Running throughout the cases considered in this report was the expectation of American officials that they could control the actions of dissident groups which they were supporting in foreign countries. Events demonstrated that the United States had no such power. This point is graphically demonstrated by cables exchanged shortly before the coup in Vietnam. Ambassador Lodge cabled Washington on October 30th, 1963, that he was unable to halt a coup. A cable from William Bundy in response stated that, "We cannot accept conclusion that we have no power to delay or discourage a coup." The coup took place 3 days later. Shortly after the experience of the Bay of Pigs, CIA headquarters requested operatives in the Dominican Republic to tell the dissidents to turn off the assassination attempt because the United States was not prepared to cope with the aftermath. The dissidents replied that the assassination was their affair and that it could not be turned off to suit the convenience of the United States government.